So I wanted to have this presentation today to talk about Bower, my ASP.NET Core course, which has been around for a while now, even though I've been updating it, has been using Bower from the beginning. And one of the reasons is it has a pretty easy path to getting client-side dependencies into the right directory so that you can start writing code pretty quickly. Unfortunately, Bower has been depreciated, and so I wanted to have this conversation to sort of talk about the different options you have there and some ways to maybe make it a little easier on you. So a quick couple slides, a quick slide about who I am. I've written more than 20 courses here on Pluralsight. I have written a number of books that I'm pretty sure may all be out of print by now. I'm the owner of Wilder Minds, and I'm making a movie about software developers called Hello World Film. So you can always see more about the film there if you're interested. And let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk about what Bower was and kind of why I think it's going away. And then we'll introduce NPM, Yarn, and libman, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up, take your questions, and see if we can all get past this sad, sad moment in Bower's life. So Bower's been around quite a while, but not quite as long as some of the other solutions out there. And it was an interesting library in that it was really focused on just handling client-side dependencies, whereas things like NPM have always handled node dependencies, and then sort of as a throw-in, they could also do client-side dependencies. Bower's really committed there. But at some point in the life cycle, in the last year or so, they realized that a lot of developers were having to do duplicate work, putting them into NPM, and having to put them in Bower, and some big projects, Angular is probably the biggest one of those, decided to really focus on NPM as a client-side dependency, and I think the Bower team saw the writing on the wall and decided to sunset it. Now, it doesn't mean that Bower isn't going to be continuing to be updated for security patches and such, but there's not really any continued investment. If you can see this slide well, you'll actually see that the last update was on March 28th, which was not that long ago. It means they're still doing some small changes to make sure that, Bower doesn't completely wreck someone's code, and it's not going to magically just disappear one day. Well, it probably will, but not in the foreseeable future. So if you're using Bower today, it's not like you have to go as soon as this call is over and flush it from your project. But you do want to start thinking about life after Bower. And we talked about what Bower was, so I'm not going to really dive into that. One of the things that Bower didn't do was package your dependencies for production. This was always something that you really needed to do separately. In an ASP.NET Core, a lot of people relied on this Bower RC file to just copy all the Bower dependencies and end up putting all of those in production. And so that's something that by moving to some of these other systems, it's sort of going to encourage you even more to do. So let's talk about the alternatives. And then I'll show you how some of them work with ASP.NET. NPM, or Node Package Manager, is the big boy on the block. It's been around the longest. There's lots of active development on it. It's a lot of good ways for people to use it. And so you're going to hear a lot of people talk about Node Package Manager as the solution. There's also a solution out there called Yarn from the Facebook people. And Yarn is interesting in that it is still getting the packages from NPM. They're proxying it through some of their servers. And a lot of the benefits of Yarn come around to performance during builds and such. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get there. And the last is something that Microsoft is actively working on right now called libman. Libman is going to be in Visual Studio 2017 version 8. I think it's 15.8 is when it's going to actually ship. There is a preview that I'll show you to see what libman is and kind of talk about the benefits and detriments. So let me walk through these, and I'll show you an example of how they're going to be worked. Node Package Manager's benefit is that it's the largest repository out there. It's actively developed for server side, so you know it's not really going away. Has a strong ecosystem around NPM, and most of the big libraries out there already know that it's their first choice for putting out uh, um, their libraries through NPM. And so you have that benefit. On the other side is you still need to solve the deployment problem. So NPM doesn't really do anything about packaging up these dependencies for you. And for ASP.NET Core, in order to use these, you really need either middleware for development time, or you need to tackle this packaging early on. So let me show you what that looks like. And in a typical ASP.NET project, this is just a simple example. A lot of the projects until recently in Visual Studio would use Bower as the default. In the recent versions of the project generators, they actually just copy the dependencies for you into the magic lib folder with no real idea about it. And so this is one of the options that I did want to discuss if you're moving from Bower, and that is to physically go to each website, download the projects, and put them in your own folder, which is more of the way we used to do client-side dependencies. The problem there is no real upgrade path. It's going to be up to you to remember that there's a new patch out there and that you need to go find each individual directory. And if you're like me, you probably are checking all that code into source control, into Git or whatever you're using for source control. And so it becomes this extra labor piece that you need to worry about. And the idea about these package managers is to sort of get around that. So in case you haven't used Bower before, let me just talk about it very briefly. Basically, it's just a small JSON file that describes what libraries you're going to be using. And when it downloads one of these libraries, if it needs other libraries, it will go ahead and get those as well. Because of this magic Bower RC file, in ASP.NET, we're able to sort of cheat the system and say, go ahead and download the dependencies and go ahead and put them in our www root folder in a way that we can access them from our client side. If we look at NPM, we can see that instead of a Bower package, instead of a Bower JSON file, we have this thing called a package JSON file. And it looks very similar. In fact, if you just rename your Bower JSON file over to a package JSON file, there's very little you have to change to make this actually work. In fact, this is exactly what I did here. The only thing I did was change the case of the name of the project, because that is something that package.json requires, is that all packages are all lowercase. Not a big deal in the way we're using it. Remember that this package format is really used to create these dependencies as well for NPM, but we're just using it in a read-only fashion to get our dependencies. Visual Studio supports NPM. In fact, if we look over here at dependencies, we'll see NPM as a list of the dependencies, and as we change this package.json file, it will go ahead and get us new dependencies. So if we did something like getting view, it'll not only give us IntelliSense to get the view, but it'll go ahead and run the update as soon as we save the file to go ahead and get the new dependency, as we can see over here. So NPM gives us a lot of the things that we liked about Bower, and that we're getting good interaction with Visual Studio in order to make this all work. NPM as well, unsurprisingly, has a command line interface, so if you've been living in that world as well, you can use it there. The only problem with NPM is that, let me go ahead and show all files, is it puts everything in a magic node_modules directory. And out of the box, none of our code could actually access this. And so Scott Allen actually created a great little piece of middleware. I went ahead and contributed a little something to it to help some of the cases I had, but it allows us to use NPM packages directly without having to get into the process of actually building that packaging piece. And I'll talk about the packaging piece in a minute. What he did was create something called, whoops, wrong file, called the use node modules project. It's under ode2code.use node modules. And this allows you to basically point at the node modules folder and make it accessible here in www root. And so what this is saying is, go ahead and when we look for when the client side looks for a folder called lib, treat it as if it was already here in the www root folder. So if we look at one of the views really quickly, I'm not going to belabor this too much. We can see that like Bootstrap is coming from lib, and down here at the bottom, we'll see that jQuery is coming from lib, and all that's doing is mapping that lib folder to the node modules folder. It's aliasing it, even though it's outside the www root folder. So for development, this works really well. But of course, when you actually deploy this, you're going to need to either deploy the whole node modules folder or get into the packaging story. So let's take what we have here and let's talk about Yarn, because Yarn is somewhat related here. Actually, since I'm already screen sharing, let's go ahead and pop over to the Yarn example so I can talk about it. So in this project, I'm using Yarn, but you can probably notice that Yarn is just using a package.json file. Because again, Yarn is this installable package manager that just uses, excuse me, that just uses the same package JSON that NPM uses, and in fact uses the same repository for those packages. So if we open up a shell real quick, we could get all of our NPM packages by calling npm install. That certainly works, but we can see it's not super fast. This is one of the problems that people have with npm, is just the speed of actually getting all of these dependencies. I'm going to break it real quick. And Yarn, which I've installed separately, is another command that I can just call. I can either say yarn or yarn install, and it will go through that same package, and it will install the packages as necessary. Notice it said already up to date because it can really look at the packages much more quickly. It keeps caches on the client side of the packages to really speed up this process of doing the updates. So again, Yarn is just another tool for using the same NPM packages and package format. The only issue here is that there isn't Yarn support out of the box in Visual Studio, and there's probably a plugin or two, but if you're using ASP.NET and you just look at the CS proj, you can just do a build process to call Yarn for you. And so I've actually said, before you do a build, go ahead and run Yarn so that when I issue a build, we'll see Yarn run here, and then our build is executed and we're all good. So that's one way to actually do this. All this code will be available up on my blog later. So if you're having problems seeing exactly what I'm doing there, you'll be able to get it a little later. What NPM and Yarn don't do is this idea of packaging. So I wanted to introduce this very briefly. There's a couple of different ways to do it, but the way I've been doing it lately is just with a gulp file. If you're not used to gulp is basically just a tool to allow you to build steps pretty easily. And in this case, I'm just using gulp and a couple other libraries to just copy specific files or specific directories in my case, and just copying them into www lib. So when we get to deployment, the size of what I'm sending to the servers is much, much smaller. The problem with just copying the whole node directory is it contains everything required to build that project. And so you end up having much, much, much larger files. You could imagine when you shipped a file, if you not only sent the assembly, but also every piece of source code and every thing in your source control, every time you wanted to deploy it, the size would be just astronomical versus that just a handful of assemblies that you're building. And that's really the difference here, is having some step that during development and during production is different. And I'm doing that in startup by making sure that use node modules is only happening in development. And then I'm assuming that part of the process of running that gulp file is going to happen before you actually deploy it, whether you're deploying it to Azure, your own services, or your own hardware. That's going to be a solution for production. So let's talk about the last option, libman. Now, libman is a little harder to do because it does require a preview version currently. And they actually, as I started writing this presentation, they actually pulled libman out of the 15.7 version and decided it was going to be in 15.8. So the build I have here probably won't work for you for a little while until they get past this next release. I actually manually built it from the NuGet project and installed it into the preview, and it does seem to be working. But libman is an interesting solution. So libman takes basically its own JSON file called libman, and it has a couple of different ways to deploy the projects. Now, libman is more focused on actually copying files into www root for you. In many ways, libman isn't really a spiritual successor to Yarn, NPM, or Bower, in that it really doesn't do dependency management. Now, I know that you think about Bower as being dependency management, but the idea behind libman is some people don't want to deal with any of these tools and want to go back to the way they used to do things when they would get things maybe from NuGet or maybe manually from files. And so libman has this idea of a provider, and there's two providers out of the box, a file system provider and also a CDN provider. The idea would be that if the projects are available in a CDN, which a lot of these we're going to be talking about are, you could actually pull the files directly from the CDN and deploy them to you. I'm using the file system provider as an alternative to using gulp. So here you'll notice in this project, I have a package.json already because I'm using NPM or Yarn, but instead of writing a gulp script, at some point I'll be able to just use libman to say, you know what, here are my libraries I want you to copy. I want you to look in the node folder for jQuery, and I want you to copy just these two files. Those are the only ones I need for production into a www root folder for me. I can go down here, and what's nice is instead of my approach with gulp where I was copying the entire directory, I can really pick just the assets, excuse me for my cough, just the assets I actually need. I can still copy the whole directory if I want, but in many cases, this really allows me to limit the exact files I'm going to need. And so libman will eventually become an option for doing this. The other thing about packaging for deployment is if you're using something like Browserify or Webpack, some of this goes away in that you could package those as part of your Browserify and Webpack as well. Though some client-side dependencies, like you could think about Bootstrap and jQuery, you're probably going to want to get separately outside of what Webpack is doing. Webpack is more about packaging up for app development than it is for anything else. So let's go back to the slides. I'm going to end that screen share real quick. And you can see the slides sort of talked about what I talked about, so I'm going to quickly go over them. and start to take your questions. I hope you've learned a little about the alternatives out there, and let's go ahead and start asking questions.
Okay, cool. Let me go ahead and jump in here, Shawn, and take a look at what's coming in. So I've got a question here for you. Should I continue using Bower if I'm already using it?
It's a good question. Uh, it depends on the project and the lifetime and that sort of thing. You're going to eventually have to make the change, but you can certainly defer it probably for another year or two if you absolutely want to. I would probably bite the bullet sooner rather than later, but Bower isn't going to magically go away. I just don't want to. I wouldn't want to be surprised by when that actually happens.
Okay, in your opinion, which is better, NPM or Yarn?
I'm using NPM for most projects, but most of the projects I'm building aren't so complex that I'm gaining the benefit of the speed of Yarn. I don't have NPM reloading my assemblies that quickly. One of the benefits I didn't really talk about with Yarn is they started out building a lock file to guarantee that I was getting the exact same assemblies. And that used to be the big win, but as of NPM 6, NPM is doing the same thing. And so really what you're gaining an advantage with Yarn is speed. I like the integration with Visual Studio since I do about half my projects there. And so I prefer NPM, but it's a really close race. If you're in love with Yarn, I certainly wouldn't abandon it and go back to NPM, especially if you already integrated it. Okay.
Here's a question. Hi, Shawn. What is Microsoft's recommended approach?
I'm not sure they know yet. So what I've seen is that, of course, this libman is coming with the use case of people that haven't really dealt with package managers before, ones that want to sort of go back to the way they did it with early MVC and certainly web forms. And one of the use cases is the one I showed, which is using something like NPM or Yarn to get my dependencies and then using libman to deploy them for production. So I don't know that they have a recommendation yet. They really want to see how the ecosystem shakes out. And this is a little bit of a soapbox, but this is kind of where Microsoft, I think, wants to be. They don't want to be the arbiters of what wins out there. You know, they don't want to go ahead, you know, 10 years ago, Microsoft might have made their own to compete with it to try to provide a solid solution for their developers. Now they want to be part of that larger ecosystem. And so I think for the most part, they're waiting to see how it shakes out. Their decision to take Bower out of the default templates means that they do know it's going away, and they didn't want to weigh on users by forcing them to, you know, be developing projects that eventually get outdated. But I think we're going to see probably in the 15.7 or certainly in the 15.8 update some of their more recommendations. But I think they're, like a lot of us, still listening and waiting and seeing what the best approach is.
Okay. I have a note here. I don't know if this is a question about your opinion or whether or not there's a risk to this, but the way it's phrased is anything that is deprecated should no longer be in use, just across the board?
So typically in these sorts of projects, there's this idea about deprecating something or stopping it. And Bower is very specifically saying that we're giving you the warning that at some point we're probably going to go away, but we're going to support it for, in many cases, quite a while. This sort of lends itself to the question of whether I should move now or later from Bower. But you should certainly be thinking about it and having it on the project plan to at some point move away from it. Just because it's been deprecated doesn't mean you have to go rush and fix it right now. And that's a lot of what happens with deprecation. If you see the way that Microsoft deprecates their APIs, you get a warning, you know, through one sort of round. with the idea that maybe that deprecated piece is going to be deleted at some point. So you can think of deprecation as the warning that the bad change is coming or the good change is coming, that you need to start thinking about it. But it certainly isn't the day it becomes deprecated, you need to run and fix something immediately.
Cool. I'm going to pick this question because it has my favorite terminology in it across the board. What would you recommend to use for tree shaking, file concatenation, and minifying or minifying?
Minifying, yeah. That is such a almost religious argument at this point. Because I do a lot of Angular and I'm doing a lot of Vue these days, I tend to stick with Webpack, even though I'm not in love with it by any means, to do a lot of that work. Browserify does a decent job of that as well. I'm in the camp of we're fighting too hard with tree shaking to try to limit the code we have. I actually kind of like having all the libraries and the source code available to me instead of depending on things like map files. But I'm clearly losing that argument over the long term. As for minification, there was what was the second thing they were looking for? Tree shaking,
concatenation, and minifying.
And minifying. I tend to still use gulp scripts a lot to do that, and so I'll use uglify to minify, and then usually a gulp script to go ahead and concatenate it at the same time with just simple gulp work. Though I think Webpack is certainly the winner for kind of doing it all in one step for you. I just hate to have one more build step in my system, and that's my hesitation about bringing in Webpack. But it's certainly one that I can't not recommend. If you're already using it or you're thinking about using it on your own projects, awesome. If you're already doing NPM, if you're already doing Angular, you're already doing React, you're probably already there.
Great. Okay. With libmin being so new, what should I do to learn more about it?
There is a great post, and we can put it in the links afterwards. It talks about its creation, and this was something that was originally sort of conceptualized by Mads Christensen, and then someone on his team took it over. But we'll go ahead and include a link from the ASP.NET the Visual Studio blog that talks about it in pretty much detail of how it works, why it works, and how they're sort of still taking feedback on it.
Cool. Okay, so just enough time for a couple more questions, and we're getting some great ones in here, so I want to make sure that we pull a good one. Let's see. I did see a question in here about whether or not these updates and this information was included in your course.
No, not yet. We're doing an update of the ASP.NET Core course for 2.1 when it releases, and it'll have these updates in them then. So should be sometime in the second quarter, depending on when Microsoft actually pushes ASP.NET Core 2.1 out.
Okay. So this is an interesting question. It might be a little bit controversial, but I'm interested in your feedback. Why is the ecosystem so confusing? Across the industry, there's so many options. It feels like the life of developers is confusing when there are already so many varied choices for web frameworks.
Well, this is the compromise. And it's one that is fairly new to Microsoft developers. For a long time, Microsoft wanted to be very prescriptive. At least this is my opinion. I'm sure that some Microsoft people are screaming right now when I say this, but for a long time, they were very prescriptive. We're going to give you the box, and we're going to encourage you to stay in the box, and we're going to write everything that you need to be in the box. And that worked for them in some ways, but they were losing the ability to have better solutions out there with just a broad community in general. And so in their embracing of open source, and embracing of the web community in general, there's some complexity that comes with that, and there is this compromise. Do you want sort of the closed system where the best solution may be the only solution, or in some cases the less than great solution might end up being the only solution? Or do you want the added complexity of having a lot of solutions there and letting you pick the one that works the best for you and your organization? I'm glad where we're at, but I absolutely acknowledge it is adding more complexity. Um, I would start thinking about, as a web developer, looking outside of Microsoft and looking at the web ecosystem in general for what is the prevailing thought there. There is a risk there of sort of attaching yourself to someone who wants to stay so much on the bleeding edge that you feel like you need to be moving, every 6 months to a new technology and a new JavaScript framework and such. That is a risk. But sort of seeing what's coming down the pike. If you ever had a chance to look at Ruby and Rails and you looked at Node, you probably saw where like ASP.NET Core was coming. So when then ASP.NET Core came, you're like, oh, okay, I get a lot of these concepts because these are good ideas, instead of sort of the ivory towerness that was a Microsoft developer ecosystem 10 years ago. So I don't have a magic bullet of this is what we can do to reduce complexity at the same time as benefiting from a larger set of developers bringing in new ideas.
Yeah, lots of options. So I guess just keep learning, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, my suggestion is always to just rewatch my courses as many times as you can. No, that's just a joke.
Okay, this is really great. Okay, so maybe one more question, and then we'll thank everybody. And just a quick reminder: we did record this session. It will be available in a couple of days, and we're going to publish this and put it on our website in full. Give us about a week and a half for that to get that packaged. So I am going to pick a random question in here because they all look really wonderful. Here's one. Can we use libmen to package up view files and other scripts for front-end development?
So the question is how it's related to something like Webpack. So if you're using something like Browserfire Webpack to package up the files, that's not really what libman is for. Libman isn't packaging, it's simply copying. So you could certainly use libman to get the files that you have in your system that are views and such, and just put them in www root. But if you really want to package them, using something like concatenation in Gulp or Grunt, using something like Webpack, or using something like Browserfire are still the main solution. Libman is really here to solve a problem between the highly complex and the not complex. It's not trying to handle the highly complex projects themselves, because there's good solutions out there for them. What they found was there were some people that were writing fairly simple apps that just used, let's say, jQuery and Bootstrap, and there wasn't a good solution for just copying files into the right places for them, much like we used to do by having the scripts and styles folders directly in the project.
Great. Okay, so that's all the time that we have for today. Shawn, do you have any closing thoughts or well wishes for our audience?
Yeah, today I'll have a blog post up on my site with links to all the source code I showed you. If you want to continue the conversation, or we didn't get a chance to get to your question, feel free to put them in the comments to that blog. I will answer them as quickly as I possibly can.
Awesome. Thank you so much for doing that. And thank you again for being here and presenting today and taking questions from the audience. Everybody, thank you for joining us and checking us out. I'd invite you again to check out wildermuth.com. Continue the conversation. Shawn's going to be available. That's awesome. And thank you once again, and have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.